when the world has got you down. And
Alzheimer's sucks. It's an equal opportunity disease that chips away at everything we hold dear. And to date, there's no cure. So until there is, we continue to fight with the most powerful tool in our arsenal, love. This is Love Conquers Alls, a real and really positive podcast that takes a deep dive into everything Alzheimer's, the good, the bad, and everything in between. And now, here are your hosts, Susie Singer-Carter and me, Don Preece.
Hello, everybody. I'm Susie Singer-Carter.
And I'm Don Preece, and this is Love Conquers Alls. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Donald. I'm so excited today. How are you first?
I know.
I'm platitudes.
Fine.
I need platitudes.
new year and a new beginning, and
That's right.
let's just hope that this one, maybe heads in a better direction than last one. So
Right.
and I think, today may kick us off right in that direction.
I think so. We have the greatest guest ever. I'm so excited. So that's why I'm like jumping. I'm doing leaps over all our
right to it.
platitudes. Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just quickly put a plug in for I Love Lucifer, our other podcast, which is now in the finalists for 4 finalists in the Audioverse Awards. And we're not asking you to do anything but just send good vibes. So we're excited about that. And you guys know it's a comedy horror, and it's fantastic. And it stars Adam Levy from The Witcher and HBO's Industry.
Her eyes are literally burning with an outrageous color of red. My fearless daughter moves in to plant a kiss, but Portia manages to hold her away. Tanya's lips hover inches from Portia's. Hot. From the heat from Portia's eyes. Don't be daft. Now, in the grips
And
of this
that's
wretch.
it. All right, so you guys, if you're a caregiver and you have someone that you're caring for with dementia or Alzheimer's, you probably experience anxiety on a daily basis about forgetting. I mean, I do. I know I do. Every time I can't think of a word, or I'm writing and a simple word doesn't come, I literally get panicked on. Like my heart starts beating.
I know. I'm very well aware of this.
I mean, I do. And, but I listened to our guest on Anderson Cooper, and it rocked my world. It changed how I thought about it, and it gave me a peace of mind, because I do have a good memory, and like my daughters always say, Mom, we can't remember words all the time, right? So
Let's get to it. Today our guest is ScottSmall. And Scott is a distinguished memory researcher, the director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Columbia University, and the author of a fascinating, not to mention practical, book entitled Forgetting: The Benefits of Not Remembering, in which he explains why forgetfulness is not only normal but also favorable. Until recently, most everyone, memory scientists included, believed that forgetting served no purpose. But new research in psychology, neurobiology, medicine, and computer science tells a very different story. Forgetting is not a failure of our minds. It's not even a benign glitch. It is, in fact, good for us. And alongside memory, it is a required function for our minds to work best. Scott's book includes a wide variety of studies that include pygmy chimpanzees in the wild, visits with the iconic painter Jasper Johns, as well as the renowned decision-making expert Daniel Kahneman, looking across disciplines to put new scientific findings regarding forgetting into illuminating context, while also revealing groundbreaking developments about Alzheimer's disease. And that's what we're very excited about talking about today.
Right. And just to put it in layman's terms, the next time you forget your keys, just remember that forgetting is good for you. So please welcome our exciting guest, ScottSmall.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks for the very exuberant intro. I will start off by saying that although I'm optimistic in my personal world, I am, like most trained physicians, scientists, ever skeptical, not necessarily optimistic. But Don, if you do mention the new year, a new year perhaps ringing in with hope, there's a lot of hope coming out of the laboratories of Alzheimer's, and it's translating practically. There are new drugs, there's new hope, and I can easily articulate cautious optimism.
Wow.
That's amazing.
It's funny because on whenever we hear about a
amazing.
new drug, and it's always, wait, does it reverse it? Does it stop it where it is? Does it prevent it? And is it in all those areas?
Well, if we could start from the beginning, perhaps the beginning is the mechanics cliche. You can't fix something unless you know what's fundamentally broken. And it turns out, and there are many ways in which I apologize to my patients for the slowness in us really isolating the root cause of Alzheimer's, but there's a sense that we're finally there. And the only silver lining of COVID, once you identify the target, the biomedical enterprise is endowed with such wonderful tools that you can genuinely, realistically be hopeful that effective drugs can be developed.
And I think it stems from kind of what in your book, when you talk about the mechanism, the molecular
Exactly.
mechanism that you discovered. You always knew there was a mechanism for memory, but there wasn't a mechanism identified for actually forgetting. And so there's two mechanisms.
Yeah,
is that right?
that's exactly right. And quickly, let me just clarify. I've been involved, like most of the world, in finding mechanisms that regulate memory and pathological forgetting. So we've all been working away for decades, trying to understand the mechanisms of memory, which have been illuminated by my mentor Eric Kandel and many over the course of decades. And the belief was always, forgetting is just a glitch, it's just memory gone bad. But the research in the last 10 years has clarified that that's not the case. There is a completely separate group of mechanisms that are dedicated to active normal forgetting. And if I may quickly insert, because this needs to be clarified, in a very simplistic sense, one can think of pathological forgetting, what happens to us when we develop Alzheimer's, perhaps when we age, worsening from our own baseline, versus normal forgetting, the forgetting we're born with, the forgetting that all of us have, yet everyone, including everyone who sits next to me at a dinner party, says, "Oh, you're a memory doctor, let me tell you about my forgetting." And it turns out to be normal forgetting. And so the book is really written in contrast to the pathological form. There's nothing good about that, but there's a lot good about the normal form of forgetting.
And which I want to get into, like what actually identifies the difference between pathological and, which we all want to know. That's the big question, isn't it? Like, where is that line when it becomes normal and pathological? I mean, I saw it in my mother, and I could only say from my experience how I identified it. And and it's interesting because not everybody is attuned to it, because I kept telling my family members something's wrong with mom, and they were like, "You're overreacting. That's normal. She's fine. We don't notice anything." And I was saying, but it's different. It's different. I'm telling you.
That's the distinction. And first of all, let me just say, in this very engaging conversation, and not to put my neurology colleagues out of business, ultimately, if you really want to know if it's pathological, go see your doctor. And Los Angeles has wonderful, wonderful neurologists. But you hit on it. The real way for your own self or for your family members to know if it's pathological, if it's worsening from someone's baseline. So sounds like your mother's lucky. She's very close to you, her daughter. So you detected something worsening from her baseline. The problem is that it's often very subtle, and we all forget. And the kind of forgetting you're asking about can actually be the same as just any of us forgetting our keys. So it's really not so much about the kind of forgetting early on. Later in the disease, it's clear. But at the earliest transition from normal to pathological forgetting, it could be subtle, but the critical point is it worsening compared to someone's own baseline, as in the case, sadly, with your mother.
And does that come out sometimes? I mean, can you relate it to not just forgetting, but behavior, as opposed to just, I forgot that, but now it's affecting their behavior? Is that a sign?
So Alzheimer's is a progressing disorder. It starts first, and it incubates in an area of the brain that really is dedicated primarily to memory. And that's why, if you think back, I don't know where your mother is right now, Susie, but if you know anyone with Alzheimer's, and just think how it progressed over time. And that progression is not just a worsening in one area of the brain, it's a spreading across other areas of the brain. And so, Don, when you ask about behavior, that's a fuzzy word, but often when people really have behavioral problems with Alzheimer's, which could be the most devastating to the patient and to the family, that tells me, the neurologist, that the disease has already spread out of the area of the brain where memory alone functions.
I think it's interesting. I just had a text conversation with a friend of mine whose father-in-law is 92 and experiencing dementia, not particularly Alzheimer's, but probably some combination thereof. And he had a fall, and luckily, I guess he had internal bleeding, but it stopped, and he's now exhibiting like incredibly violent behavior. And and I said, that's not, and she was just lamenting about the fact that maybe, I can't believe how bad, Alzheimer's, if it brings him to this point. I said, I don't know if that is Alzheimer's. If it could be medication they put him on. It could be that whatever damage he had on his, when he fell, is affecting him. If it's that quick of a change of personality, it doesn't seem like it would progress
I think you're showing great clinical skills, Susie. That would be my first worry. And the good news about that, if it is medication, and if it is a bleed in a part of the brain that can affect behavior, those are fixable potentially, right? Alzheimer's, sadly, until now isn't.
Exactly.
The only nuance there is that often when people describe something that happens suddenly, acutely, which is not the way Alzheimer's progresses, if you dig deeper, actually, maybe there was some aggression before, maybe there was some, and so this just accelerated that. And this is the problem, is that we're relying on a history, a narrative. And as you're filmmakers, so you know better than I that narratives aren't always faithful to the truth.
That is right. And I noticed even when my mom early on, when I was detecting like some of the changes in her memory, I detected a change in her personality. With the way that she related to me, there was an edge to it that wasn't there before, and I couldn't really articulate it, or would probably sound very pandering to myself, but I felt it, I knew it was there, and it was real. So and that was really what tipped me off. And it was like, my mom's not acting.
And if you think about so it's easy for us brain scientists to compartmentalize different parts of the brain and to think of discrete regions. But of course, if any of you, either of you, were to have a fun night partying, and then the morning after you're a little bit groggy, you're a little bit out of it, you're out of sorts, you might also be, and it's only because your memory is not great, you also might be a little bit grumpy or a little bit. So, and that's really, I have to tell you, it leads to an interesting point about what we do clinically. Maybe we'll get to the cautious optimism about how we can really be physicians, and that, by which I mean intervene meaningfully. But most of my patients who I spent often hours with are thankful, and I say, well, why are you thanking me? I've done nothing. They said, well, and the patient's saying this, they're saying, well, at least I now know it's not my fault. At least I now know that I'm not, that my spouse who's thinking that I'm just being absent-minded, it's not just me not caring. And so there's a certain amount of gratitude that comes from knowledge, even if it's not, sadly, at this point, actionable.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That's so, it is important. And I learned that the hard way, because I always say I made my mom's had it for 16 years, just so I can frame it for you. And so I learned the hard way by making a lot of mistakes, and then learning, what works and what doesn't work, and putting myself in her, being the most empathetic I could be, just to try to wrap my head around it, and realizing, now, and I used to say to her, once I got the hang of it, that, I could see her searching for a word, and I know how frustrating it is for me if I can't find a word. Right. And as it progressed, I could see her searching for the whole statement she wanted to say, and then I could see it pass out of her head, and I could see her give up. I could see her
and
give
maybe
up.
blame herself, and maybe be ashamed.
Yes.
All things that we have to try to eradicate from the.
And she knew. I mean, Susie found a diary of hers from before she even was diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
In her late
60s, and
yeah.
she was writing. She says, "I better write this down now, or I'm not going to remember."
That's really
she
interesting.
knew.
I won't
That's really
remember.
interesting.
And
she also said something very poignant in those few pages. She said, I can barely, I have to, as Dawn said, write quickly. And she goes, but there's something to be said about forgetting. She said, it's because I don't have to remember all the bad
Well,
things.
that's really, and it is ultimately philosophical. It's not philosophical, hard to understand. It's philosophical because it's about us, society, and our families. That's, I consider, philosophical, and that's a really perceptive point on your mother's part. And one of the things my patients have taught me, and I think I included in the book, is that we tend to over-index memory. And it's not,
Yes.
God forbid, saying that it's a good thing necessarily, but we live in an information-heavy world. We all want to be the person who can quote. We all want to learn fast, more so than previous generations. And what my patients have taught me, particularly in the early stages, I'm not talking about the late stage, but in the early stage, when someone is forgetful, profoundly forgetful, rarely are they profoundly despondent if they understand it's not their fault. And what they've taught me is that you don't need your memory to engage in the joys of life, in art and beauty, and in family love. And that's a profound philosophical lesson that I'm thankful to my patients for teaching me. I certainly live in a life where it's all about who can quote it's arguments, you want to know the right paper to counter argue, but at some point in our lives, it's actually not that important. The other stuff is more important.
Oh my God, you're like I love you so much. I mean, I got this perspective from another woman who is she has a method called the Dawn method which is she talks about living with dignity and she really takes the importance off of memory. And I actually started a clubhouse where people meet and the club is called Macy, which is Memories Are So Yesterday. Basically, they're not that important, right?
No. Yeah, but I completely agree. I love the acronym, but try telling it to a kid who's sitting down for the SATs, or try so remember. And can I just say quickly, the book, even in the normal forgetting, is not saying memory is bad. It's saying we need our forgetting to balance our memories. So it's balance.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. No, I'm just saying that when you compare it to someone who is disabled, so I consider it a disability, right? Of course it's a disability. Right. However, that doesn't mean you can't live a life and enjoy a life with quality.
And as I tell my patients, and it's always difficult, and you have to be sensitive about this because you never want to minimize anything when you're talking to a patient. But there are many chronically progressive disorders that we live with, right? Diabetes. Guess what? Diabetes, if you live long enough, you'll have a lot of pain. You might lose sight. You might lose your limbs. You could really suffer. Forgetting may be a form of suffering for many of us, but as you pointed out through your mother's wonderful insight, and as many of my patients tell me, if it's just forgetting, the suffering is actually not that bad. What the real suffering is, again, not to minimize, is that you're basically giving someone a diagnosis that you can maybe convince them that right now and for the maybe foreseeable future you won't suffer except for lack of memory, but it's a time bomb. And the end of Alzheimer's is not a pretty picture. We should not whitewash that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. It's that thing that we as caregivers grapple with is, and I had the issue from the get-go, which is quality of life over quantity of life. So, our medical system is set up to prolong life as the physical life, as opposed to, really valuing the quality over the quantity. And that's where I had issues, because when my mom was in her full, in her best of mother, she would, when we would visit certain people that were maybe like my grandpa, who was in a skilled nursing, and she was fantastic with people in there. It's how I learned to have my bedside manner. And she'd walk out and say, Susie, me, never, don't, like, I've had a great life. Thank you. Okay. So you know what she's saying. And but as it happens, you're like, I can't fulfill that for you. However, what I can do is make whatever time you have here with whatever skills you still have, the best it could be.
That's spot on.
You say there's emotional and non-emotional memories, and how do they relate to the idea of forgive and forget, PTSD? Are they both are they the types? Are they important to forget? I mean, in order to move on.
In some ways, as you nicely summarized on at the beginning, the book has many chapters that all cohere around this idea that forgetting is good. Some of the chapters are a little less intuitive, some a little bit more. I think when it comes to emotional forgetting, I think that's more intuitive. We all know that the phrase, we need to forget to forgive. We all know that there's a problem with PTSD that is by definition, a disorder of too little emotional forgetting. We all know in our daily lives that if we perseverate over our painful memories, we might become difficult people and suffer ourselves. So when it comes to the emotional part of memories, I think those were easier chapters to articulate. Why we need to balance our emotional memories with forgetting to live an emotionally balanced life. What was new, though, is that this all comes out, as you mentioned, Susie, from the new science of normal forgetting that only emerged in the last 10 years. And I wouldn't have written this book just as a feel-good book, if it is one, without that hardcore science. I am a scientist after all, and again, most of that science was not done by me, but by a universe of colleagues.
I mean, it's funny, we talk about forget to forgive, which can sometimes lead to people getting remarried after they've divorced. I don't know how healthy that is, but it's something. Otherwise, we just. But that you do that, you forget. Literally, you can have a horrible.
Right, and that's why I think the balance analogy, the teetering balance, is a good one. You don't want to forget everything. You don't want to forget all emotions. You don't want to forget the bad part. But what you want to do is defang the memory from preventing you from living a better and happier life. That balance means that occasionally you're going to be swinging one way or the other. You might make mistakes because of too much memory or too much forgetting. But it's factually true that you need to balance out your memory with your forgetting, whether it's emotional or informational.
But we don't do that purposefully. I mean, the brain does that for us. Is that correct?
Yes. It's interesting. So, as I've been talking about the book to public audiences, often I worry that I won't convince people of the fact that we need our forgetting to balance our memories. I seem to convince people so much that often the questions in the Q&A is, okay, doc, you're a doc. You've been working on how to fix pathological forgetting, too much, bad memory. If I have problems with my normal forgetting, how could I fix that, right? Doctors are mechanics that try to fix things. And the one thing I learned a lot. I worked a lot on this book to make sure that it was sort of compelling and correct. And so in every chapter, I sort of have a guide, as you mentioned, Jasper for creativity, Danny Kahneman for decision-making, Eric Kendall for memory. In this case, I had a guide who's the PTSD expert at Columbia. And we were talking about PTSD and what parts of the brain and, how it taps into this new forgetting. And we were then talking about why is it that two people come home from a wartime experience, experiencing the identical traumas, emotional traumas, right? One person could forget that enough, not the details, not completely, but enough to not develop a psychopathology, whereas that other person can't. right? And you should know that in the field of PTSD, they are trying to tap into the new science of forgetting. There are various drugs we can talk about, but what I found most interesting is it turns out that the most important factor is, if you're exposed to trauma, is to surround your life with love, laughter, and happiness. And even now I slightly giggle when I say that because I'm a hardcore, molecular guy. That seems a little bit namby-pamby, but it's actually factually true. And
Oh man, you're
basis
speaking
of,
my
it's
language,
the basis of
Scott.
our show.
Yeah, I mean, love conquers all, doesn't it? I mean,
and
in
by
a
the way, just to illustrate how a basic scientist like me can reduce even love ad absurdum, and I'm now self-spoofing, but it is anchored in the science. One of the things that love does is it releases in our brain something called oxytocin. Maybe people have heard about it. One of the things that maybe the most profound thing that oxytocin does is it relaxes the area of our brain that stores fear memories. And so in some ways, this is a simplification. I hope you do not edit this out, Don, because it is. But it is not inconceivable to say that one of the reasons we're able to love is only when you're able to relax your fears. Think about a kid who goes to school, right? Kindergarten. It's not neurotic to say that 5-year-old is worried, is fearful, and if that kid can't overcome their fears, they're going to live a lonely life. It's only when you relax your fears. Relaxation is another colloquialism for forgetting your fears, at least temporarily. Do you open your heart to love? And then it becomes a vicious cycle, or as I say, a pas de deux, because vicious cycle sounds vicious. So
You also talked about humor, and it's that things that do increase your oxytocin, right? And is that includes sex? I'm sure it does, but I'm just
it completely does, and I somewhat I can't help but let my personality creep into a book, and that's just sort of pinching my sanctimonious, maybe too religious friends. If oxytocin is good, if it's part of love, clearly everyone will agree with that. But be careful what you wish for, because too much oxytocin breaks the holy matrimony of one-on-one fidelity, and bonobos prove that. So you have to be careful about what you pray for, I would say, in this case.
Right. That sounds good. But, with my mother, I always say that there's, I have certain tricks that I use to open the door when I visit her. And it's, it gets harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, right? My mother was a musician. She was the most amazing singer. I have her recordings from Capitol Records. We play and sing them all the time. Those open the doors. I make her laugh now because she has a tremendous wit. So and that when I can make her laugh, she's suddenly
and this comes back to the closing of the loop, the pas de deux, because when you make her laugh, she feels better, but it also shows how she still has her humor and she still has her chops and her music. I don't know if you saw with Tony Bennett. I mean, absolutely incredible. And I know, because I have a friend who knows him well, and it's no secret, he has Alzheimer's, pretty advanced.
Yeah.
Yes,
but you put him on a stage. It helps to be on a stage with Lady Gaga, of course. But you put him on a stage, and he remembers the full songbook. Even to me, and I know this phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really, really profound about how pockets of memories could be preserved.
My mother, it's just only within the last year, and I blame it on COVID because she's been isolated too much. And even though we've been Zooming, Zoom is not the greatest thing, as we all know, for to connect. So we've done the best we can. But she's lost her ability to sing along, and that was the last thing to leave. And she knew the words better than we did.
One of the things that worry me about COVID, besides everything else, is the social problem of COVID. Think about it. It's a double whammy. We're isolating ourselves. because we have to for our bodily health. But in doing that, we're worsening the trauma that many people experience, the emotional trauma of COVID. And you're absolutely right. You mentioned at the get-go that you have dogs, so do we. One of the classic papers that was published in one of our most prestigious journals is showing that not just us with ourselves and our family and our friends, but us with our dogs. When we look deep into our dog's eyes, they release oxytocin. There he is. He's a genius.
There's my dog, right on cue.
Yeah, he's immediately admitted to Columbia, I can tell you that. So they release oxytocin, we release oxytocin, and that oxytocin creates this social bonding. It's real. It, again, might sound soft, but it's not. That is hardcore as science can be.
And you can't get that through Zoom. You just don't.
And you can't. Thank you, Dan.
can't.
And you cannot get that from Zoom. It's so interesting. And so maybe we get a little bit of that, but there's nothing. There's something about, the brain is clever. Just like the brain of most dogs can't look at a screen and see something, our brain deep down cannot recognize that I'm looking into your eyes right now. And so there's probably very little oxytocin.
Exactly. Oh, I agree with you 1,000%. That's why I would never online date.
So you've heard stories of, veterans who came back from World War II.
Yeah.
And they never talked about it, ever.
No.
They never, it was their way of coping with it. And then other people talk about it all the time. And as far as getting rid of those memories, it feels like, okay, if I talk about it, then it becomes part of my reality, and then I'm going to continue to memory it. Maybe if I don't talk about it, it'll disappear. What are the effects of both?
Yeah, well, again, I'm not prescribing a treatment here. I'm actually not a psychiatrist, although I'm appointed in psychiatry at Columbia as well as neurology. But simply do what works for you, right? So for someone who's not talking about it, that seems to not kind of shake up all the memories, maybe that works. But I think the simple answer is often if you don't talk about something, if you don't air it out, then it can fester and it could start becoming worse. And talk therapy of all kinds, not just with professionals, but talk therapy among friends and family is a great way to air out memories, and then at the very least, not to forget the memories. We should never forget D-Day, right? We should never forget 9/11. But we don't want to fester because that's going to then give the enemy too much power. It's then going to not kill you at the battlefield. It's going to slowly kill your mind later, your psychological mind.
And that's with anything. That's with any upset in your life.
Any upset. And that's where I think therapy, talk therapy again of all kinds, I think is a true therapy. And most therapists do this. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a therapist, and I'm saying, basically what you're doing is you're accelerating the forgetting process, and he generally agrees with it. I mean, if you think about more formally, obsessive compulsive disorders, phobias, right? The way we treat that, the most effective way, is to have repeated exposures to the phobia in a benign setting. That's tapping into your forgetting mechanisms, period. There's just no doubt about that.
It feels like to me, what I'm getting is that the mechanism works on like in a high level way. I'm going to say it really, crudely, but it takes away those emotional, or it takes away all the excess of what you don't need in that memory and leaves you with what you do need to make good choices. So, and I'm going to bring it back to a plain, like an easy to understand example, like a divorce.
Yes, let's talk about divorce. I'll tell you what couple therapies use to accelerate forgetting. Now we know this in retrospect. Before it became a banned substance, but yeah, let's talk about divorce.
Well, I know what you're going to say. Okay, so let me preface this, you guys. So I went through a horrible divorce, and it was really, really hard on me. And it was my second one, and the first one was not easy, but it was better. This one was just chaotic.
It was harder on me.
And I literally had just, yeah. Well, Don's been my best friend forever. Poor God bless him. But you know, and I had seen the movie, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? And I was like, yes, I want that. I want that. I need to go and have somebody erase this loop that keeps going through my head and making me cry. And so I went to a hypnotherapist and I said, I want to get rid of just these memories and keep the good ones. Can you do that for me? And she said yes. Of course she didn't, because I can't be hypnotized anyway. So that didn't work at all. Whether or not it does work, you could probably tell me that. But is there a way that we can accelerate getting rid of those? Because now it's taken me 10 years, and now I can actually look at it with an objective frame and go, this person not good for me, and not cry.
Well, you've used the very natural gift of forgetting, and that's time, right? But you're asking, why do I have to wait 10 years suffering? Couldn't I have accelerated it? Again, back to a legitimate question to ask a practitioner, a doctor. And I can't condone or critique hypnosis. I don't know enough about it. My hunch is that it can't just go in and like find that one little pocket and delete that. But essentially, good psychotherapy does that, coupled with drugs, and drugs accelerate forgetting, and that's why often it's a combinatorial. What I was going to talk about actually is not the suffering after a horrible divorce. I'm sorry you had to experience that, Susie. What I was talking about is couples therapy, therapists who try to preserve a friendship or a marriage, and this is a while ago when I would lecture on how I'm trying to develop memory pills for Alzheimer's disease. I got this question a number of times from couples therapists who said, "Well, that's great, Dr. Small, but when you find a drug for forgetting, please let me know, because it's gonna allow my couples therapy to thrive." Because in essence, it sounds like you had a bad marriage, but many marriages falter on too much memory and too much baggage, right? Letting go is another of the many colloquialisms of forgetting. Letting go. How do you let go? And what they were using until it was banned is something that we know exactly what it does, and that's MDMA or ecstasy. It actually does accelerate the forgetting areas of our brain. And you might know, Don, back we were talking about PTSD, it is now shown and currently tested more formally as a therapy for PTSD to relax those brain areas that are just burning with too many memories, burning hot and burning our minds.
Does it target that molecular mechanism for forgetting?
It targets, so when you say,
It does,
when you talk to a neurologist and you talk about mechanisms, you first think, again, back to the car mechanic analogy, you first ask where, and then you ask what. The where is clearly this region in our brain called the amygdala, where fear memories are actually stored. That's relatively new. People always knew the amygdala was part of the story, but beautiful research out of Stanford has shown that that's the storage of your fear memories, and you can turn it up and turn it down, at least in our model systems. What ecstasy, MDMA does a lot, but clearly what it does is it turns down that area that's burning too hot. No question about that. And I will say, since we all love, it sounds like, think about, it's actually interesting to pour through the papers that have, back in the early days, tried to understand what ecstasy does, why does it make people feel so good, and so they've collected all the common words to describe the experience. And it's all about connections and love and feeling a sense of well-being. That apparently is such a great feeling that it's ecstatic, and that's why it's called ecstasy. And so fear memories are important. Let's not forget, if we have no fear memories, we probably wouldn't make it out of kindergarten, right? We no longer live in a jungle,
Exactly.
But speak to a junior high schooler. It's a social jungle.
It's a jungle.
You want to know
sure.
how to manage that. You don't want to just be, I'm Ollie optimist, I'm happy, I don't care. You have to care. You have to not get hurt. And that's why your fear memories are important.
Right,
and this comes
right.
back to the balance idea. But you can't let you can't let that tilt your balance and then say, I'm not going to school, or I'm just going to stay home and play video games. That's not going to work.
Right.
That continues through life.
Right.
I mean, the life is junior high. I mean,
it
continues.
That's so true, Don. All the lessons we learned in junior high still apply in any sandbox. It's so interesting. We think we become wiser as we age. We do, but not when it comes to social dynamics. The sad thing about junior high is that what gets imprinted in junior high is our humiliation, and that is hard to shake. And so when you see, and that's why bullying
really
is horrible. And I was just watching a movie with my wife where, you know, it was about high schoolers, and in the current age of social media, I have no idea how they manage that. I mean, I remember how ruthless we all were when we were junior high schoolers. It would, I mean, revenge and acting out, all that kind of stuff that you might be sorry for later. But guess what? You can't delete that video. You can't delete that comment. It's out there. It's horrible.
Exactly.
I feel bad for my friends who have young kids.
Yeah, and it's beyond high school now. I mean, it's all social media. It's the bullying at all levels. It's
humiliation.
Yeah. And I'm too sensitive.
Humiliation
for it.
is an example example par excellence of a form of memory that has to be relaxed, and it's easier said than done. Whatever we're talking about here is never going to be easy.
One of the things that you talked about in the book, which I found, you know, ironic, because which was a way to accelerate forgetting, the good kind of forgetting, was sleep, right? So that sleep is the function of it. And you know, ironically, when you're upset, when you're going through something traumatic like a divorce, and your mother's moving in with you with Alzheimer's, and your life is imploding, and you're a sandwich generation with a young daughter, and you go, but guess what? Sleep goes out the window. I didn't sleep well I literally slept 2 hours a night for a year.
You know, it is actually fascinating, isn't it, that we spend something, if we're lucky, a third of our lives sleeping, and we do it in a position of complete vulnerability to the world, right? And so you would think on first approximation, there's no way that Mother Nature would design us, because we need to survive in the jungle. And it is one of the core requirements to live. People who are forced to be sleep deprived, not a few hours, but true sleep deprivation, will lead to death. And we do it. Our mammalian brothers and sisters do it, meaning all dogs, mice, etc. Flies do it. We all need to sleep at least a third of our lives. And it's always been a great mystery, unlike why we need to drink water or to eat food, which we can explain easily, we intuitively understand. What's up with sleep? Why? And it's one of the most fascinating questions. And one of the answers, which is now gaining traction, was proposed by Francis Crick. So Francis Crick is one of the great Nobel Prize winners. There are a lot of great Nobel Prize winners. He's up there. And he's the guy who first cracked the genetic code in the 1960s. And that is probably the most important finding in biology, at least. And he said, okay, well, that's easy. Let me figure out two things, consciousness and sleep. And then he went to the great institute, Salk, at UCSD, just south of you, and he spent the rest of his career trying to figure out sleep and consciousness. For sleep, he was the first one to propose formally. And it's a proposal that was so out of left field that if I would have proposed it, no one would have listened. But because it's Francis Crick, they did. He formally proposed that we sleep in order to forget, that sleep is a form of smart forgetting. And it took a long time to really test rigorously in the way we need in a lab, but he spawned a whole group of graduate students who are now luminaries in their own right, who have finally shown that one of the things we do when we sleep is that we sort of, we forget, we organize our mind, we get rid of extraneous matter, information. Remember, your brain is not exactly your portable camera device. but it effectively is memory happy. It always is trying, anything that you're being exposed to within your waking day, your brain is saying, I'm going to try to remember this, I'm going to try to remember this. And it ends up remembering way too much information, to the point that if you don't sleep, and I've had the experience of not sleeping for 3 days, you become psychotic with too much information. So what sleep does is it neatly trims down your memories so that you get rid of the extraneous stuff, but it also, topiary-like, accentuates the important memories. It doesn't just delete all memories.
No, I like that.
But it's not a passive experience.
that metaphor.
It's not a passive experience because then you go, and especially for someone like Susie who remembers every second of every dream she has, I do not. She has a whole other world that goes on when she goes to sleep.
Right.
I know I dream too. I just don't remember it. But she has an entire. So it's not passive.
It's not passive.
I want to ask you about that. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, Dr. Small, because I do have a whole other life in my dreams with other locations that I go back to that aren't in my real life, people that don't live in my life that I know, cars and places and you know, like malls that I go to, and it's actually exhausting. I remember them during the day.
I'm going to clarify a lot in this call, but I'm certainly not going to clarify the transmigration of souls. So don't ask me to go there. If that's what you're suggesting, you have perhaps a separate parallel life. You might. No. You really might. No, I love that in literature. It's called the metaverse, the meta-universe.
No, but she dreams stuff, and she'll say to me, she says, "What do you think this means?" I go, "What do you mean? It's exactly what you're experiencing in your wake day life."
So I can't. I'm not sure I bring that back to forgetting. But what I can say is that we don't. Most of our sleeping time is not engaged in dreams. Dreams probably play out certain things, and in playing them out, they're not playing other things, and so they're part of the topiary sculpting. But what really was interesting to me there, and I have to say again, I learned a lot in reading for the book and talking to experts and reading stuff that's slightly out of my natural home base, which is Alzheimer's, and there's just no question that we need to sleep, to forget, to be more creative people. That is a really interesting punchline. And it took me a while to convince myself that I can even say that, and because others have said it in different ways. And basically, the idea there is that it's always hard to pin down complicated terms, but in psychology, they pin down creativity in a way that I think makes sense to most of us. Creativity is not something out of the blue. It's not that eureka that suddenly, you see something. Most creative people, whether they're scientists or artists or in any walk of life, if you know a creative person, that person is being creative because they do two things. They expose their brains to a lot of information. So visual artists, visual information, musicians, music, scientists, maybe scientific information. So you need the memory part, but you need the forgetting part. This is what's so interesting. People have really exceptional memories will not necessarily be creative, almost the opposite. You need the forgetting part to keep those associations in your brain loose and playful. It's that playfulness that creates the alchemy of forgetting, of creativity. And that's really interesting. Emerson had this quote, and I'm loving, people are sending me from around the world quotes. Artists, thank you very much. Well, I insist they call me Scott, but sometimes they flub and they call me Dr. Small. Thank you very much, Dr. Small, for the illuminating book. But you know that artist X, Y, and Z, writer, philosopher, poet X, Y, and Z figured this out a long time ago, and I actually talk about that in the book, how artists figure out how the brain works before we do. But Emerson has this great quote where he says that morning, how does it go? It's morning is the imagination of our minds. Evening is when it's burdened with memories, and it's really just incredible because he sensed that. I think you speak to maybe you, Susie, or your mother back in the day. Most artists feel that they need a good, refreshing night's sleep to be able to really be creative, for that alchemy to happen, most likely.
A lot of creative people can have a lot of stimulation going on. And I love a lot of stimulation. I'm like a hyper girl. Give me coffee, I'd take a coffee drip. I'm good on that. But when I'm creating, especially when I'm writing, I don't like any distraction. I can't, because I already am.
Right. So all the information is there. If you were one way, one has to be careful with oversimplifications. Again, my typical refrain. But people who have really, really good memory have all that information, but it's just stapled with steel. They can't be playful. They can't engage in creativity. That's what creativity is. And in some ways, it's my favorite chapter because of the importance of creativity in our lives.
Is that what causes writer's block?
That makes so much sense.
I mean,
No one.
I was just wondering, when you hit writer's block, is there something that's going on? Are you just thinking about other things, or?
That's a really interesting question, Don. I guess I would imagine there are a lot of forms of writer's block, but that's a really interesting question. Might a forgetting pill help writer's block? It's not maybe a complete coincidence that drugs like alcohol have been used by many famous writers to unblock their writing. Again, I'm not a doctor.
And pot, yeah.
And pot. I'm not condoning all that or prescribing any of that. But in this general discussion,
Right.
That would, on first approximation at least, make some sense.
And hallucinogenics
Well,
too.
there are many. I was going to say many a movie has been written on hallucinogenics, but yeah.
Yeah, hallucinogenics I think
that
are a
makes
little bit
sense.
different. I think what they do is they're an active process, and they might open up a pocket, that kind of thing. I'm not sure that, and I know a lot about these recreational drugs. I'm not sure that, and I'm all in on Jonathan Pollard's book. Microdosing. Again, not as a doctor, but on the forgetting part, I think it's more the drugs like alcohol, like ecstasy, that relax the forgetting, that allow that kind of sleeping, that allow that kind of creativity to happen.
Interesting. I'm really always going on 13 years old in my head, so no wonder. I'm just a playful girl. I'm just creative.
Honestly, Susie, playfulness is exactly the buzzword. Playfulness. I try to sign off. I run a center at Columbia. I run a center for schizophrenia. I work with a lot of technocratically driven, really smart people, and we bang away at science. I try to end every Zoom or meeting with the playful plea. Stay playful, keep it fun. Otherwise, what's the point?
I respect that 100%.
I thought of this, and to me it's so fascinating. Do you know anything about dreams and Alzheimer's? Because dreams come from a different part of the brain, do you feel that people with Alzheimer's may dream?
That's a really interesting question.
Is there anything on that?
So if I can rephrase it at least in a way that I think I can answer, do our dreamscapes change as we develop Alzheimer's? I actually don't know that, Don. That's an interesting question. Yeah. One thing I should say, that sleeping seems to be beneficial for Alzheimer's. That's a complicated story, and so I'm not sure it's related to anything I've been saying. But I don't know if the dreamscape actually changes. It probably does.
It would be hard to tell.
At some point it would be hard to tell, but if you look at artists, and I talk about de Kooning, right, together with Jasper, at some point it definitely influences your creativity and your output. The question with de Kooning was whether it impacted his later years to the point that it should not be showed in public. But when they decided to show it at the Museum of Modern Art, I think in 1997, it was they excluded some of the art that they thought was maybe subpar, but most of it is just the genius of a late stage giant. So it's all interesting.
Wow.
I mean, do they monitor? Will monitoring brain waves say if you're dreaming or not?
It'll say if you're dreaming or not, but it won't tell you. I think what you're asking to me, the more interesting question, you're dreaming, but are you dreaming more or less? Are you dreaming like Susie, or are you dreaming like you and me, Don? Boring.
Or just dreaming like you did, dreaming like you did before Alzheimer's, or dreaming, is there a different type? Obviously, there's no way to, we can't record dreams yet, but.
What are these groundbreaking developments on Alzheimer's that you were talking about?
Without going into the science, because that might take a little bit more time, what we now know is what is, in medicine, we think, not just neurology, we think of what goes wrong in the cell. In the brain, it would be neurons. And cells have thousands of molecules. I think people know that. But we organize those molecules into pathways, so like a blueprint of a complicated machine. And so we think of pathways. And the pathway that used to be thought to be the cause is now probably not. That's one reason why all the clinical trials that have been testing are generally disappointing. But the upswing is, in parallel with the old ideas losing traction, the true pathways that seem to be playing the dominant role in Alzheimer's has been clarified. And once you have that clarity, then the biotech industry can start developing drugs. And that's happening as we speak.
Fabulous.
Wow. And just a time frame? Do you have an approximate time frame for something that
Well,
you think?
time frames, doctors have always gotten into trouble with time frames because we sort of borrowed from Stalin on the Soviet 5-year promise. We always say 5 years. Somehow that seems right. Medicine, biology doesn't work in years. I think the better analogy maybe is if in the past we were swinging in the wrong playing field, lights off. Now we're in the right playing field, lights are completely on and illuminated. And so the home run will be hit soon. Whether that's a year, 2, or 5, it's hard for me to say. But again, the only silver lining of COVID is that it's shown us that once we're sure, the collective we, are sure of the cause of something, there's a lot of new tools that we just didn't have a few years ago that can quickly mobilize to find meaningful drugs. And that's why there's cautious optimism. And some of the drug companies that I work with, they're not by nature overselling, but they truly believe in the next few years meaningful drugs will come out of this new effort.
Real quickly, would anything ever reverse it?
We have to bite off what we can chew. I think most of my patients, maybe your mother 16 years ago, if I told her I can arrest it, that would be maybe good enough. A little bit of forgetting, and that's fine. That's our goal right now, or meaningfully slow it.
Right.
But now that we have these insights, there is some reason if you catch it early enough, much like cancer, you might be able to reverse it. But let's not engender false optimism. Let's focus on what we think we can do.
Understood.
Well, we can't thank you enough for being here today. I mean, this is everything about this is so fascinating. We encourage everyone to go out and get your book, Forgetting: The Benefits of Not Remembering.
We really thank you so much for taking the time. You're such a mensch, as they say in French. And Don, what do we always say?
Well, as we always say, love is powerful, love is contagious, and love conquers all. And we thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Take care.